Uh, Welcome everyone to the monthly cohort gathering call for the certification program of Green Seminary Initiative. We're doing these calls every fourth Wednesday, and we are recording this and each of our calls so that we'll share it with each of you that are on the call, as well as the rest of the members of your team that for whatever reason are not able to join us today. Also, while I'm saying that, if there are any of these recordings that you think you haven't received or you can't find and you'd like to refer back to them, just email us at director@greenseminaries.org, and Abby and I will get one of these back to you. So we're glad to do that. Each month we invite a mentor to talk to us and kind of facilitate a discussion around one of our certification standards. So section B.2 in the liturgy, ritual, and worship section is titled Worship Competence. Last month, Lisa Dayhill spoke with us about section B.1, incorporating environmental themes into liturgies, ritual, and worship. And B.2, worship competence, is pointed more in the direction of the classroom, whether it's a homiletics class or worship class, but both of these obviously blend together. So we need to feel free to be able to do that today. But Heather, I'm gonna, without further ado, allow you to kind of take it from here. Each of these Green Team members are familiar with this particular standard, and you are a member of the Drew Green Team. So we're grateful for you making the time to be with us today.
Thank you. And I want to compliment and congratulate all of you for creating this interdisciplinary organic way to do theological education. I think this is a very helpful thing, particularly to Drew right now as we're going through a major curriculum revision, or maybe reformation, something that goes deeper than revision. But let me just begin with some basic questions and observations that I have reached over the years, and being someone who teaches worship primarily and then some special courses in preaching. The focus will be worship, and then I'll make some comments about homiletics and competencies as we reach those points. So I would basically say the first task, if we're dealing with classroom, is the very first competency we have to develop is the ability to create and form a community. We have to be able in a classroom to enable students to be able to create an environment of what we could call it the beloved community. And if that is the primary task, how to communicate and transform patterns of perception that have been formed over at least more than 2 decades for some students, of when you come into a class, you come in as an individual and you are basically looking about individual achievement, how to enable a classroom and those students to consider forming a group ethos or an environment. And how do we encourage them to assume the presence of the holy as it manifests in that very ordinary process of taking a class? I think that is so basic, it's very difficult to sometimes see. It's a fundamental. If they cannot form that kind of community, then whatever emerges out of that will not resonate with the kinds of goals we assume eco-theology and justice and eco-spirituality should be able to demonstrate. So we need to enable our students and ourselves to conceive of an interdependent self. And we are a blessedly diverse community these days, I believe, in most seminaries. There isn't a commonwealth sense as it would have been even 20 years ago. Most students are coming from such different backgrounds. And I think the additional piece is there are those who live on campus, but fewer these days. There are those who are holding full-time jobs, and so they have a very different ethos when they come in. And chapel, which was beautifully addressed last gathering, chapel no longer forms that eco-spiritual base, that environment that expresses a school's mission. Now, that's not a confession I think I'm alone in making. I think there's an erosion of that formation of identity. So that feels like a very fundamental, basic category that I'd like us to consider. So if that is a competency, how does a class become a community in order to do this work on both worship and eco-theology? One of the things I do, for example, is I mess with the seating and their relationships. First class. Everyone is assigned after the first 20 minutes to a household. Now, in my worship class, I borrow Paul. So, we have houses of Corinth and Rome and Ephesus, and the students are required to sit in that arrangement with those people for the entire semester. They have to read together, they have to write together, they have to eat together. The rule is, for the long class, nobody eats in the house unless everybody has something to eat. So they have to figure out how to feed each other. They have to design required worship service together. And that is peer assessed. Their grade is not given by me, but by the community. And then there's an opportunity for every member of that household to email me separately as to how the ethics of that worship design went. So when I do other courses like the Native American course, then I use the 6 directions. There's the house of the north and the south, and so and earth and heaven. So you basically pull students out of their given pattern and force them into an accountability educationally to building a community so that the work will in fact be able to be sustainable beyond a single individual's leadership. So the goal is that all are to thrive, not some survive. And I do think the some survive piece is a deeply embedded educational structure that we have to overcome, no matter what the class is. So for me, for worship, for preaching, those things are really very important. Next is the importance of enabling students to recognize their context and their connection to it. And that means you design assignments and presentations that enable students to recognize place and to be able to tell the story of place, both historically and environmentally. So that's a competence. How do they know where they are? If I say, what time is it? I usually get the hour. Sometimes I get the liturgical time. Very rarely do the students look out the window and say, it's fall. So it's a sense of having them recognize both time and space, but place particularly. And now Drew has been known as the forest since the 1700s by at least the English speakers. And so we have some advantages built in. For example, in our chapel, higher than the cross is carved a giant acorn. And we can go from that. I give every student an acorn that they are to carry until they graduate and then go plant somewhere. But then they are required to engage in the literal landscape that the school stands in. And I do think that's important, no matter where the location of the school is, because then they will carry that into the communities they serve, being able to read the context and the connection, not just the human history, but the ecological history, if you will. Now, Laurel will remember we had a professor who taught into his 90s, and he would use his first lecture to establish a sense of space at Drew. And he would start it in the Ice Age. And he would describe what was going on in the landscape outside the classroom, dating back to the Ice Age. And then at some point, the students would go out and they'd look at the concave spaces where the last of the glacier melt. I mean, and then in the midst of that, he would weave the human history into a place where students could tell their story as connected environmentally to the place that they were. So I think that's a primary competence that we want them to have, being able to recognize context and make connections both in human history and in terms of environment. So those are two things: foster skill in community formation, and to encourage recognition of the place, of your place, and how to tell its geologic and anthropological history, how to do story history. And that is, of course, core both for writing prayers and for preaching. Which place? Where are we? Next, I would say, third, you should be able to outline for the students the key competencies and fundamentals that you will use and they will help model in the classroom as well as sanctuary. So there isn't a divide between those two spaces. I think some of our problem is when students have spent so much time in an educational space and they try to carry that sense of authority, I have the answers, into their congregations, they don't realize it's a very different dynamic. So I'm very interested in merging that fundamentals competencies. I use a primary definition of worship as worthyship, the Old English, to esteem the being of another, to honor another's being. And that's a core that I use definition throughout the class, adding others, but that's a presentational one, because then it allows us to move from the anthropology to the ecology, I think, to esteem the being of another. And if the ethical and liturgical are held together, then when another's being is demeaned or damaged, whatever that process has been, it cannot be called worship. It cannot be called preaching the gospel. See, so the holding the ethics very close to this is, I think, very important. In the moment, I'm in almost heaven. I'm a West by God, Virginia person, and that's where I am at the moment. So I also have a very high regard for my experience and the community experience here of what's 4-H. And I'm just curious, do you all know what 4-H is? I'm asking the collective. Yes, wave your hands. Okay, all right. Now, I'm honoring my own origins and naming this, but also it's, I have high regard for the work that they do with the youth in many rural communities that continue to merge both the science of animal husbandry and care for the earth in ethical ways. And the creature kindness, there's a lot of possibility for moving in that direction. But all right, 4-H. So let me go back to the key competencies and fundamentals. So for my class, there are 4 H's. The first is hospitality. The second is honesty. The third is humility. And the fourth is humor. And those are the principles that they have to both identify and embody, and how they treat each other in the tasks that they've been assigned, whether it's preaching or worship or a political action outside. So it's hospitality, honesty, humility, and then humor. And I think the humor is one that all of us that do this kind of work need, because particularly these days, it is really to be edgy and in despair. So I think it's a very important human piece, and for some communities, for example, you aren't human until you know how to laugh. So I'm just holding on to the humanity piece. So the pieces about, hospitality, some of this is really obvious. I'm not going to spell it out. I want to talk about the one that might be surprising, and that is humility. A lot of people don't like that word. It's not one of the ones that students really resonate to. So I have to really work at what that means. And I, for example, think that we need to engage in this work in immersion learning environments that, in fact, reduce the illusion of human control. That is an experience of humility. And in our classes, if you can't do it in a worship or preaching class, then we do need these immersion courses, learning environments that reduce the illusion of human control. And I found a wonderful story. I'd heard it years ago as a child, and then found it again, and I'm just going to show and tell a book that I quite like right now. It's called simply Earth, and it's part of the Bloomsbury series where they're doing object lessons. And this particular one is written by a planetary scientist and a professor of medieval literature. But how do we conceive of the Earth? So I'm kind of borrowing the story from them. And the story they do about humility is that there was 1,000 years ago, if we can even conceive of 1,000 years.
Here it comes. Okay.
Okay. 1,000 years ago, there was a Danish king who invaded successfully England, and it was King Canute, C-N-U-T. And he's basically been forgotten. Nobody remembers him, at least I'd be surprised. You might remember the story that I had a vague memory of, and that is a monarch that marches his court down to the ocean. And they're standing there at the ocean, and he orders the waves, the tide, not to come in. And he stands there and gives the order and gives the order. And what eventually happens is, of course, his feet get soaked. Now, the way in which I learned this story was that was an example of the vanity of a ruler. But a 12th century historian reminds us that, in fact, that was exactly the opposite reason why he marched them to the sea. It was to teach them, this is the, hang on, I'm going to get the name of the historian. It's Henry of Huntington, 12th century. He said the purpose of that story was an act of public humility. Can you hear me? Okay. So he wanted to emphasize that there were limitations to human power. That's why he had them come with him to the sea and order the waves. So that was an example of humility that I think our students need to encounter. Again, the limitation of human order, and he wanted to teach them that the earth is greater than we are, that the force of nature is larger than ours. So a competency in a worship or preaching class is that recognition of that sense of limit. And I think that is essential not only for how we interpret scripture, but certainly when we decide what order of worship needs to go for what day. I'm moving on now to an obvious. I just want to state what you all know. You teach the sacraments as the ecological mysteries that they are. That this is living water. And out of that living water comes acts of justice, earth and food and table manners. So to reduce in the best possible way to the primary forces of fire and air and food and water, at the core of what we're trying to engage them with as a competency, to experience natural symbols and primary forces in a way that removes some of the layering of the scar tissue or technological glitches that have covered our consciousness. So that's it. I mean, it's so important. I could say it 5 times, but I'll just say it once. Teach the sacraments as the ecological mysteries that they are. And enable a community when you say, what is the earth? How can we conceive of the earth? If you're dealing with primarily Christian worship, I think it's a very powerful teaching image to say the earth is Christ's body now, and see what that evokes in a community. Can they make that move? And again, of course, you have to do the theological protective pieces on it, but I think it's important. I'm up to, on my count, I like using, I'm very manual, I'm up to my 6th count of my second thumb. Humility, honesty, hospitality, i.e., you need to also expose and introduce into that curriculum, into their competencies, the ecological saints or guardians of the planet notion. You teach with the saints so that they know the stories and can model on some of the actions. And you use these as you teach both prayers and patterns of worship. And again, the story and sacrament link. For example, I'm just thinking of St. Francis and Pope Francis's letter, combining those on our common home, makes a very powerful liturgy, using some of the prayers and some of those sections literally read or preached about or danced to, so that they model on, these are 2 human beings whose word action has in fact made a difference in relationship to earth. One of my ongoing inspirations is Sister Dorothy Tang and her work on the rainforest and the farmers and land development. And I'm assuming you maybe remember her, but she basically knew the men that were assigned to kill her and read the Beatitudes to them as she was gunned down. And in her memory, this work goes on of trying to save rainforest. And so she's for me, a very powerful model of both scripture and life lived out. And I think we need saints, or if not saints, ecological saints, guardians of planets. I think we need those people in our teaching. And Wendell Berry or Wingari or Rose Brewer, who's at Minnesota, Standing Rock, some of the powerful witnesses on water and Standing Rock were incredibly important to engage both as preaching and prayers this last time. 7th, use the arts, body, poetry, dance, image, and require students to do that. I taught a class on performance and preaching. The dancers were terrified of preaching and the preachers terrified of dancing, but ultimately it comes down to body, and that's the most ecological truth of all. How to make people be able to reside in their skin as a blessing and to proclaim through it their embodiedness. And I think the piece that I'd like to end with, I'm going to read a poem, but as an example of what I've just said about poetry and body and preaching and dance. But I believe we need to teach students, this is a competency, to conceive of life as if, and that is to encourage the use of imagination. And that's in a culture where if they are addicted to grades, they will not do anything they have not already mastered. They are so afraid of risk and failure. So we need to adjust how we do our grading to unlock that addiction in some. And then there are the students who they just want to get through this. They just want to get it over with. How to engage them to be embodied in the present. So to conceive of life as if, while paying attention to the as is nature of life. It's as if and as is. All right, I'm going to close with a poem. And it was a poem that can be both danced and prayed as a form of preaching what is very difficult to preach. So I'll just read this. It's Jane Hirschfield, and it's called Let Them Not Say. And I think I'm also reading it to us because this is our call. Let them not say, we did not see it. We saw. Let them not say, we did not hear it. We heard. Let them not say, they did not taste it. We ate. We trembled. Let them not say, it was not spoken, not written. We spoke. We witnessed with voices and hands. Let them not say, they did nothing. We did not enough. Let them say, if, as they must say something, a kerosene beauty, it burned. Let them say, we warmed ourselves by it, read by its light, praised, and it burned. So that would, I think, pull everything together as to what the challenge is. The challenge is despair and paralysis, and how you enable students to encounter looking into that fire, and yet respond in acts of resistance that are life-giving.
Wow. Thank you, Heather. So much. We hope that you have questions, ideas that have maybe emerged from this presentation by Heather. For those of you that have joined us after we got started, we have Reverend Dr. Heather Murray Elkins that is speaking with us. Heather is Professor of Worship, Preaching, and the Arts at Drew Theological School. Abby looks like she has shared us a link to learn more about Dorothy Tang. Thank you, Abby. And has also shared with us the poem that Heather just read to us. So that's very helpful. And Carla in Costa Rica has shared a link, says a perspective from Latin American theology. Carla, can you, is there anything more to say about that? Just more resources to learn more about Dorothy? You may be on mute. It looks like there's a question or a comment actually that Abby submitted in the chat box, and I think Abby is in a coffee shop, so may not be. She may not be in a space where she can pick up on audio. Are you able
Yeah,
to
this
talk,
is Abby. I can. I'm actually going to unmute Carla so that she can say more about Dorothy's staying, and then I can say more about Plancestors if there's space. So let me unmute Carla.
Yeah,
okay, Carla,
thanks.
You're good.
This is a book chapter by Roy May on Dorothy staying, and it talks about when, monkeys cry and the poor die. So I encourage folks to read this.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Abby, you want to say more about your comment?
Yeah, Heather, as you were talking, I was reminded so much of the term Plancestors, particularly when you were talking about the deep time of geological experience for classrooms. And that's a term that I learned from Larry Rasmussen, but it's certainly not simply a Larry term, but reminding us that whenever we're learning about worship and ecology, it's not just about humans, it's about all that comes before us. So thank you for the deep time.
I had a question back about conceiving of the earth. Reflections on whether or not it is helpful to conceive of the earth as Christ's body. Now, Christ's body now.
Is that your question to
Yes,
us?
yes, right.
Everyone is pondering.
Well, while we're waiting, I first saw it, I think, in the 1970s, 74. It was Sister of St. Joseph who painted the blue planet out in space, and she traced around it a crown of thorns and wrote underneath, "The earth is Christ's body now." And I mean, I've carried that image all these years, but an artist saw it first.
Heather, I think that,
yeah, this is Mary Elizabeth here, and I that was one of the most provocative and interesting things that you said, I thought, because if we think of Christ's body is an image of church, and of course a huge amount has been written on Christ's body in recent years and critiqued and expanded and so on. But if you think of the church as the family of God, not just Christian, but let's just stick with the Christian imagery for the moment. It's family of God. The family of God is the whole creation. So I think that your metaphor is a really, really important one.
Thank you. I think it resonates on a lot of deep levels that I haven't got words for. That's why I appreciated the image opening the door first. If there aren't, yes?
No, I was just saying thank you, Dean Moore. And any other comments or questions for Heather? I know do you want to shift to that document that you wanted to share?
Yes, since we do have a little more time, I did want to honor some of the work that we're going through at Drew right now with a change in curriculum, and it's a seismic deep kind of change. I'm hoping we're the faculty who will be able to live into this vision. I'm trusting that we will. But Laurel helped craft a document that I asked if we could post, and it really addresses descriptions of competencies and values and what would undergird conceptual approaches to this work on environment and justice for a whole curriculum. So if we have permission to go ahead and put it up, and I thought maybe Laurel, you could answer questions or for example, we were all tasked with putting in one sentence what our shared values were as a faculty, which, is extremely difficult. So I value this sentence. It must have cost you a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. Equip students to become global citizens with a basic understanding of ecological thriving, the unjust causes and consequences, environmental degradation, resource depletion, climate disruption, and with the skills and ethics to practice eco-justice at the multiple levels based on religious visions of the kingdom of all creatures and the flourishing of creation.
And I would love to hear if others are trying to do that. This was a group written sentence because I can't write one sentence. But they did allow me in the end to put a lot of sort of clauses in. But that was, our thinking was that we needed to, we've got 4 values that are going to go across our curriculum. And to try and be able to communicate it succinctly to students instead of that, this is what we, in some ways, hope you will get out of our classes and stuff, was a really useful exercise in engaging others who didn't teach in this area as much as I did, was very helpful. Because they would question, what do you mean by this? Or they would say something and I would say, well, it's a little more complex. So it was a very good exercise. So that's why we offer this. But I also want to note that Mark had a great question for Heather. So I don't want us to lose that. And Heather might read the question on the chat line if you want to, if anyone else has comments or questions about this sort of, this is an internal document. It's still in process, but this was the sort of what we offered to the faculty to get their responses and feedback. And considering it's summer, not surprisingly, we haven't had a lot. But as we move into this very different curricular approach, what I was trying to do in this was to spark people's imagination of all the ways they could bring something into their class, because I had gotten I'd gotten used to hearing, oh, I don't know anything, it wouldn't fit in my class. You probably all have heard that from your colleagues, and it might be a wonderful conversation to have it sometimes about how we do encourage our colleagues who think there's nothing in their class that would relate, how we, help them not feel like they have to go and read all this new stuff, but what do they do that might reach out? So that's probably the third page of curricular practices that has just all sorts of different thoughts there on ways that you might bring it in. And I wanted people to be able to think that we all aren't going to do it the same way, because this topic is so immense. I can't cover everything in a series of classes. So that was another part of it. And then the ending here you see is it was a wonderful question the deans put to us: what institutional practices will develop and support this value across the faculty, staff, and students? So we just wanted to offer that as we're thinking about it. But I want to take this moment just to express my appreciation to my colleague, Heather Elkins, who I have taught with since I came. And yet to hear you speak, and to speak so eloquently, and to have it come alive even more, what you do in the classroom. I always hear the students who are, so inspired by you. But now I have all these notes, and we need to talk more about how to make links into some of the classes I teach even more. We've always had a nice back and forth, but I really am honored to have heard you. Thank you.
Well, I cut off one thing that it occurs to me now. I do want to add, and that is, in order to live into this world, we have to be able to apprehend, comprehend, conceive of our own mortality, and so they are required to design their own worship services, and that requirement includes what happens with my body. And they have to be very specific. And that's where, again, some of the interesting eco-theological work can come in as to alternatives, certainly to the classic embalming. So, but I do think it's an encouragement to humility and the conception of mortality. I can't see Mark's question. Would somebody read it?
Sure, I can read it. Let me get this. Is recognizing. My thing's not working.
I can read it. Recognizing the
Actually, can we have Mark read his own question, please?
Well,
Let's see.
Yeah, I can read it.
Yeah.
Abby, okay. Thank you, Heather. So my question is that recognizing the significance of interdependence, a term you picked up early, and the importance of building connections among students, faculty, and Earth in worship. When you're teaching, how do you also engage the reality and significance of difference of cultures, difference of worship styles, difference of understandings of the world around them within the classes on worship and preaching? As I look at the 4-H's, I can kind of maybe see where that fits in, but how do they get at the ways of honoring difference as it manifests in worship? I'm thinking particularly of our experience of kind of just students from around the world coming with very different understandings of how to relate to the world and not wanting to be triumphalist in telling them how they ought to do so.
Yes. One basic assignment is this worship service. Again, they've been in this household. They have to be with each other, sit with each other, process their own histories with each other. And that is, I tell them, it looks like a simple assignment. It is the most difficult one of the class because they have to be able to negotiate those incredible differences. First day, they all write on a form that they share with each other the answer to this. It goes, for me, comma, worship happens when. And then they have to fill that out. And then they post that so they can begin to see the extraordinary diversity that they're constructed with as a class. So that household must come up with a worship service. They have to decide what scripture, they have to decide what hymns, they have to decide what environment, what level of energy, praise, color, all of that, and they have to do it together. So they have some very brutal, honest, and then hopefully hospitable moments with each other. And because I learned early on, I had to have another channel where if a group was being dominated by a particular person, everyone in that household could email me privately and let me know that the ethics were being violated so that I could intervene. Now, in all these years of doing it, I came once where a household, 24 hours before they were to present their service, still hadn't decided if they were able to, given their differences. But no household has failed in doing that. And then at the very end, there's an opportunity that they as a household can bless each other, literally anoint and bless each other. And sometimes until that moment, those deep hostilities that have been generated don't get resolved. And maybe some walk out with them. Some, they're not required to do that. But because worship is the most complex thing to ask a diverse group to agree to, that assignment really functions as a way in which they must learn to make community and resolve some of those issues. But they also need to know about the incredible difference. I'm just thinking last year, I had one student who really wanted to do a foot washing, and another that would be such a deep violation of her personal being that took them almost half a semester to resolve. So that's where I see it happening. And I intervene only if they have failed completely as a community, as a household.
So,
Heather, Richard Boyce and Charlotte, I'm just interested in practicalities. You said the students evaluate these worship services. Do they do so immediately after the worship service? Do they do that in a later written form? And how do you facilitate?
Okay. At the beginning in the syllabus, I give them 5 observations. What is the flow of this service, or how are symbols used? Anyway, 5 observations. Everyone has the ones they are to do. Usually 5 students per house. They assign themselves to, I will take 1 for this service. I will take 2. So they are focused on then a 2.5-page analysis on that one topic. And then they all write on the 6th question, what could have enabled this worship service to be more helpful to you? So everybody has to write that. I gather those up, I take their names off of them and post them. That's the whole class evaluating the household. So they have the evaluations, which then is another experience of incredible diversity, with one student saying that was the most meaningful and the other one saying that was crap. But they don't have the names. They don't know who said that, but they get those evaluations. And then the house itself has to write, each student has to write their own evaluation of the ethics and the sense of how this met their principle of worship. Was this worship for them or not? So written but protected identity, and then shared, and then basically on the basis of that the emails, I determine most students it's a satisfactory, it's an excellent. We don't give the option of failing on their evaluations. Satisfactory or excellent is their choices.
Thank you.
Great question, Richard. And Mark, did you have a follow-up question? I thought we might have cut you off a little bit.
Yeah, the follow-up, and I think this is as much for me teaching ethics as anything, but also I know my colleagues that teach worship and preaching here deal with that, is in that process of negotiating difference that happens when you've got your houses together, and we do a similar thing here, groups of 4 for the most part. What tends to come out is a common denominator form. Here's the things that we can agree on. That does tend to drain some of the difference out. So it would be a different type of thing, for instance, to build your houses. Here's the house of people who are used to worshiping in Korean context. Here's the house of people who were used to reaching in African American context. Here's the house of people who are used to preaching or to worship in traditional PCUSA places. Than to put a Korean, an African American, and a Presbyterian in the same group. So I just wonder how you negotiate that.
I think that's a very fair question, and what I have resolved in that experience is not that the worship they do, the individual houses do. At least in my experience, it hasn't been common denominator. It has been more about what happens with the selection of scripture, and whether or not it's a preaching or a non-preaching service. That's the great difference. But I try to, throughout the course, present images of alternative forms of Korean, African, Native American forms of worship, so that what the class is exposed to are multiple stimuli from the media center, so that there can be a common experience in the class. Because there's so much clumping that seems to go on right now, where they won't go beyond their own experience, not in chapel, not in the way they sit in the class. So it's that's the struggle I've had, how to get them even to interact in a way that is that stretches them.
Thank you.
It is 5 minutes till the hour, but it looks like we've got another comment or question from Carla. Carla, did you want to speak to that, if you can unmute yourself? Or Abby, can you unmute Carla?
Okay. Hi. Yeah, one of the things we're struggling with is more and more of our teaching is done online. So that's a question. How do you, when you don't have people physically present to be able to provide them with different kinds of experiences, how do we do this? And we really don't know yet.
Yeah.
And Abby has just made a quick comment already to that before you answer, Heather. Just wondering if that's an idea that we may want to spend some more time on in a webinar, because that introduces a whole nother set of challenges. But Heather, anything real quickly?
That's huge. That we're all facing it. I would hope that we hold on, if we're going in that direction, to the possibility of hybrid some way, that a class that is completely online means that there isn't ever an engagement in body. So the possibility of potentially those students at some point in their courses coming together and doing that interaction, and certainly worship and the experience of being together as a community would be helpful. But the other thing that I'm aware of is the onlineness sometimes does enable diversity to come through in ways that classroom doesn't. Let me just, the one point that I've seen, particularly if you're dealing with students who English is second language, with the online possibilities, sometimes their written responses, if you allow that to flow in rather than it being all verbal, oral, it enhances their contribution. It balances out also the introverts and the extroverts in the class in ways. So there are some things to be gained in how we know each other, and certainly the online defeats, or at least changes. I was taught early on that, and it's it would be a principle that you have to agree on two things if you're going to survive as a worshiping community. You have to agree on holy space. What is holy space? Where is it we gather? And you have to agree on what is holy time. When do we gather? Now, onlineness and the worshiping communities that are in fact constituted online completely change those two principles. We can be, as we are right now, in different places, and yet we've agreed on the same point of time. So I think it really challenges to the depth of how we've taught worship, and I don't have an answer except to know how deeply it challenges us.
Thanks, Carla, for that question. And yeah, we may want to add that on our list of upcoming webinars so we can spend some more time on that. Heather, this has been a delight. Such rich conversation and ideas, and you've left us with a lot to think about. And the creativity and the wheels are turning, and our imagination has been piqued. So we are grateful for you. Heather, as you know, is professor of worship, preaching, and the arts at Drew Theological School. And we're grateful that she's such a good friend to the Green Seminary Initiative. So thank you. Next month, the fourth Wednesday of the month, we'll get together again like this. So it will be July 25th. We know that summer is sometimes a good time, sometimes a bad time, because people are moving in different directions. But we're grateful for those of you that were able to join us on this call. It has been recorded and will be shared with all of you and the rest of your Green Team members. Next month, we are going to shift gears and move into the third focus area of the certification standards, which will be building and grounds. And there are 5 sections in building and grounds. The first one being energy. So I think each of your schools have met Colby May. He has visited your schools and done the energy audit for you, and Colby will be the mentor for us on next month's call, where we'll be able to focus more closely on the certification standards as it pertains to energy. On the other, I would ask you on the other 4 sections in building and grounds, which is water and waste and materials and grounds, we haven't finalized who our mentors will be. We've got some different ideas, but if you have any suggestions of an expert in either one of those 4 areas, send us email. That would be appreciated and helpful. So Abby, is there anything else that we need to remind people of? Otherwise, I think we're done for the day.
The only thing that I added to the chat box is just a reminder that some of you, that your schools have reports and audits that are due at the end of this month. And so if you have any questions, please let Sarah and I know.
Your homework is due. And we look forward to reviewing it and getting back with you. Have a great rest of the day and a good month. We'll see you at the end of July.